When they added MRI as well, the sensitivity increased to 100%, while the specificity decreased to 65%. So they concluded that actually the addition of screening ultrasound or MRI to mammography in women with high risk will have a higher cancer detection, but also an increase in the false positives. This is a case of a high-risk mammogram here, and she had bilateral dense nodular breasts. Again, this is her MLO. Here we have a mass lesion seen on the right upper outer quadrant. This was actually proved to be benign. But on the left breast, left upper inner quadrant, there was a mass lesion, a complex solid cystic mass that was not seen on just mammography alone. Here it is with a cone-down view, with a marker placed on the area of ultrasound. It could be seen, yet on the actual normal CC image without compression or magnification, it was not seen. So what are the take-home messages? First of all, that ultrasound is established as an additional tool to complement mammography and evaluate palpable and non-palpable lesions. It has not been approved as a standalone screening tool. Studies on automated breast ultrasound have recommended it as an adjunct to mammography in screening the dense breast. And that was my last slide. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Nouran, for your nice and a very informative presentation. And now I'd like to welcome my dearest friend, Dr. Rasha Kamal, Professor of Radiodiagnosis, Qasr Al Aini, Cairo University. The talk will be MRI breast screening, together with the screening recommendations of high risk.
لو سمحت الفولدر انمو اللي فيه المحاضره هو الهوم فولدر سيشن 1 ممكن نموت بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. The title of my lecture today is Screening Guidelines and Recommendations in High-Risk Patients. And actually my lecture today will be divided into 3 sections. In the first section, we are going to discuss what is meant by screening guidelines in general. In the second section, we are going to define who are the high-risk individuals and in what way are they different from the common population. And in the third section, we are going to specify what are the special screening recommendations for high-risk individuals. And now we'll start by what is meant by screening guidelines. In general, guidelines are a course of action that streamline a particular process according to a set of routine or sound practice. In general, guidelines are not binding and are not enforced, and they are flexible and can be tackled according to our needs, but they should fit to and clarify the objective. On the other hand, screening refers to tests and exams used to find a disease such as cancer in people who do not have any symptoms. The disease should be common in population. It should have signs and symptoms which allow for early detection using a specific screening test, and when the disease is discovered, we should have adequate treatment options to treat the disease. And putting both together, guidelines for screening programs are a group of recommended actions that may help early detect or prevent development of certain diseases. And they are often broken up according to the disease process itself, the gender, the age, and some government legislations. And looking at any screening program in general, the first step is to identify the target population, which is identified according to the age and the gender which are suitable for the disease. The second step is to identify the most suitable screening test used in the screening program. And when this screening test is applied to the population becomes divided into 3 groups. We have a group who are present up there. They are the group of people who will refuse to join the screening program from the start. And we have a lucky group who are present down, and these people are those who have joined the screening program. They have undergone the screening test. They turned out to be normal, and therefore they are asked to come after a specified screening interval. And we have a group who are present in the middle. These are the unlucky group. They will need further assessment, and after doing the further assessment, a part of this group will join the lucky group, and another part of the group will go for further intervention. And now comes the problem. Does what we have just said apply to breast cancer or no? Of course, we all know that worldwide breast cancer is the most common invasive cancer in women. And the disease process passes through stages from the normal duct to hyperplasia, hyperplasia with atypia, ductal carcinoma in situ, until it reaches the manifest or invasive form of the disease. And the risk of developing the disease becomes doubled as we pass from one stage to another. Microcalcifications which characterize carcinoma in situ and tiny mass lesions are not felt or they are not palpable by physical examination, and they can only be identified on mammography. So if we succeed to discover breast cancer at the stage where it is in the form of microcalcification or a small mass lesion, most study trials have shown that we have a 5-year survival rate reaching 98%, compared to 84% for regional disease and 23% when cancer has spread to other parts of the body. So looking at all these facts collectively, I think the answer should be yes, we should screen to detect early breast cancer. And now we move to the second section of the lecture, and that is who are the high-risk individuals and in what way are they different from the common population. The word risk has a special meaning in the health and medical fields. Knowing the basic types of risks can help us understand the chances of getting breast cancer and the steps we can take to lower this risk. When we measure the risk, we have two ways of measuring the risk. The first way is to measure the absolute risk. And measuring the absolute risk, it is the risk of developing the disease over a time period. And it defines the chance or probability of breast cancer for the whole group and not individuals within the group. An example of absolute risk, absolute breast cancer risk, is the statistics which says that 1 in every 8 women will ever develop breast cancer during her lifetime. The other way of measuring risk is measuring the relative risk. And the relative risk is used to compare the risk in 2 different groups of people, for example, smokers and non-smokers, to see if belonging to a group increases or decreases the risk of developing certain diseases. And it is measured to assess the potential factors or characteristics which may be linked to breast cancer. And according to measuring the relative risk, we found that there are many factors which influence the development of breast cancer. Some of these factors are modifiable, some are potentially modifiable, and some are not modifiable. And we have many risk assessment tools that are present on the internet to measure the risk factor for every individual person. And maybe the most famous of these risk assessment tools is the Gale model. And all these risk assessment tools depend on assessing 3 factors: the clinical history of the patient, the family history, and some genetic testing. And according to this, the American Cancer Society has defined or outlined a group whom they call the high-risk women, and they further specified this group is that they are the women who have a 20 to 25% greater lifetime risk of breast cancer development. And these are those who have a BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutation, those who have a first degree with a BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutation, those who have had irradiation therapy to the chest when they were between 10 and 30 years of age, and those who have some syndromes like the Cowden syndrome or have a first degree relative with one of these syndromes. They have also specified another group of women whom they call the women at moderate risk, and these are the women who have a 15 to 20% greater lifetime risk of breast cancer development. And they further specified this group as those who have a personal history of breast cancer, women who have ductal carcinoma in situ or lobular carcinoma in situ, women who have atypical ductal or lobular hyperplasia, and women who have extremely dense breasts by mammogram. And now comes the question, how are these high-risk patients different from the common population? From the several studies performed, it was found that the high-risk patients usually develop breast cancer at a younger age, they have denser breasts, and in the same time they have a more aggressive form of the disease. And looking at these factors together, we must conclude that if any woman is at a higher risk of developing breast cancer, she should be screened earlier and more regular than women at average risk. And this takes us to the third question: what are the special screening recommendations of high-risk individuals? Mammography is the best screening tool for breast cancer used today, and it can find cancers at an early stage when they are too small to be felt. And although mammography screening is not recommended before the age of 40 years, yet it is done at an earlier age, 30 to 35 years, for women at high risk of developing breast cancer. On mammography, we are expected to find small mass lesions like the one seen here. It's a non-palpable lesion, and that's why a guide wire was placed in it. And we are expected to pinpoint focal asymmetries, like as we see here in the right retroareolar area. We have a focal asymmetry which is not present on the left side, and an underlying carcinoma was identified. And we are also expected to find suspicious microcalcifications, even if we have a dense and heterogeneous breast like what we see here. Using the post-processing magnification tools, we can see these clusters of microcalcifications in a malignant case. One of the potential new technologies in mammography, it has a potential to be added to mammography as a screening modality, is the 3D digital tomosynthesis. And actually 3D digital tomosynthesis is more or less similar to a mammogram, where the breast is placed here in between the compression plate and the digital detector. But what's different from mammography is that the X-ray tube moves in an arc across the patient, across the breast, taking a series of low-dose images at different angles, and the end result is that we have a 3D image, a 3D reconstructed image that can be viewed every 1 millimeter thickness. 3D digital tomosynthesis is expected to solve the problem of the heterogeneous dense breast, which is the problem we are facing actually with the high-risk patients. For example, this was a young female. She came for a screening mammogram, and on her ultrasound, we identified this small fibroadenoma together with fibrocystic changes of the breast. But actually, her tomosynthesis examination showed something more. It showed the speculated outline mass lesion in the upper outer quadrant of the right breast, and a biopsy was taken, and this was an invasive lobular carcinoma. Even in less dense breast, this can be classified as an ACR-B breast density. Maybe some of us would suspect that this is a small carcinoma, and this is confirmed actually on the tomosynthesis images, where we can see clearly that this is actually a very tiny carcinoma of the left breast. But until tomosynthesis becomes documented as a screening modality, mammography will be always accused of having technical limitations. It's accused of having a low sensitivity because the normal breast tissues may obscure an abnormality, and this is responsible for a large number of false negative results. It's also accused of having a low specificity because the superimposed breast tissues may give the impression of a false abnormality, and this is responsible for a large number of false positive results. And what's more than that is that if we go from an ACR-A to an ACR-B to an ACR-C and to an ACR-D breast density, both the sensitivity and the specificity of mammography is decreasing. And knowing that most of our high-risk individuals have a breast density which ranges from an ACR-C to an ACR-D, then we must admit that mammography alone cannot stand as a screening tool in screening individuals of high risk. And that's why the American Cancer Society has outlined recommendations for the use of breast MRI for breast cancer screening in high-risk patients. It should be stressed that if MRI is used, it should be in addition to and not instead of a screening mammogram. This is because although an MRI is a more sensitive test, it may still miss some cancers that a mammogram would detect. For most women at high risk, the American Cancer Society recommended screening with MRI and mammograms should begin at the age of 30 years and continue for as long as a woman is in good health. And up till now, there is insufficient evidence to recommend for or against MRI screening among women with average risk, and this is left for a decision between the patient and her clinician. MRI is also used in screening as a complementary tool to mammography whenever we want to clarify findings identified on mammography screening, to identify the true extent of the disease process and find additional mammography occult areas of disease. Whenever we have axillary node metastasis with unknown primary, when we screen patients after conservative breast surgery, when we are screening the contralateral breast in patients who have undergone mastectomy, in screening of patients with breast implants. And we'll give examples on all these indications. This is the first example of screening in high-risk patients. This was a high-risk patient. She had a positive family history of breast cancer. Her mammogram was not informative. She had a heterogeneous dense breast parenchyma. She was sent to complete her screening program by a screening examination by an MRI examination, which revealed a mass lesion which was present in the left breast. This mass lesion showed a type 2 plateau curve, which is 50% benign, 50% malignant. She had a dark signal on T2 weighted image, and she had prepectoral edema, which might signify the presence of malignancy. And actually, a biopsy was taken, and it was an invasive duct carcinoma grade 2. Sometimes in screening programs we find clusters of microcalcifications which are unexplainable. This was a patient, she came for screening, and we found this microcalcific cluster. It looked suspicious, so we sent her to perform an MRI, and on MRI we had subtle enhancement at the site of the microcalcification. A guide wire was fixed and the microcalcifications were removed, and this was a very early case of ductal carcinoma in situ. This is another example. This is also a young individual. She has a heterogeneous dense breast where we can pinpoint many areas of abnormalities. We performed a 3D digital tomosynthesis to this patient, and actually, yes, there was a large carcinoma in the upper outer quadrant of the right breast, and an ultrasound further proved this. We might think this is enough, we take a biopsy and she is diagnosed, but actually MRI has an indication in these patients. We took the biopsy, she was an invasive duct carcinoma, but we still performed the MRI because we could not identify the true extent of the disease. On MRI, the lesion showed more wider extension, and we had multiple lesions surrounding the main lesion, and she changed from a single malignancy to a multifocal carcinoma with wider extension than what we saw on the tomosynthesis and on the mammography. This is an example where we have axillary node metastasis with an unknown primary. This is also a high-risk patient. She was 37 years old, and her mammogram first was interpreted as a BI-RADS 2. And then one of the senior staffs in our department said, no, I would like to see this lymph node. It looks globular, and I would prefer to see it by ultrasound. An ultrasound was actually performed, and the lymph node was pathological, and so we decided, yes, send her to make an MRI to see what's wrong with her breast. She had these pathological axillary lymph nodes, but she had, in addition to them, a large mass which was not interpreted neither on the mammography nor on the ultrasound, and this is sometimes common we have types of carcinomas which cause subtle changes in the breast that can be easily missed during examination. Her time signal intensity curve showed a type 3 curve, which is typical for malignant lesions. And this is another lady. This is a common appearance that we see after conservative breast surgery. We have a speculated mass lesion at the operative bed, and sometimes we get confused, is it a recurrent mass or is it just excessive scarring? She was sent for an ultrasound, for an MRI examination, and on her MRI there was nearly no enhancement at the operative bed, and even the places which showed the subtle enhancement showed a type 1 benign curve, and actually going back to the T2 and the T1 weighted image, this was merely excessive scarring with operative bed fat necrosis. This is another case. She had the right breast conservative surgery, and she came for her annual screening, and in her annual screening we discovered that she developed a newly developed mass in the contralateral breast. An MRI was requested, and it revealed, yes, there was a malignant mass lesion in the left breast, and there was also, operative bed recurrence with enhancement seen along the operative scar. And this patient is one of the examples why we should never view an MRI without the mammography in hand. This was also a high-risk patient, and she came to perform a mammogram, and she was classified a BI-RADS 3 category because looking at the upper outer quadrant of both breasts, she had a large global asymmetry in the right upper outer quadrant, which was not present on the left side. But actually, the ultrasound showed nothing underlying this focal or global asymmetry. But yet, her BI-RADS was raised to a BI-RADS 4 category because we saw something extra which was missed on the first look of the mammogram. Looking at the lower inner quadrant of the right breast, there were these clusters of microcalcifications and we only saw them using the post-processing magnification tools. Actually, her MRI was not informative. It only showed disparity between the amount of fibroglandular tissue between the right and the left breast, and if it was not for the mammogram, this patient would have been missed from diagnosis. In this case also, as we said, MRI is useful whenever we have fixed breast implants because as we see here in the mammogram, maybe it's very difficult to identify any lesions at the place where we see a carcinoma, at the place corresponding to the carcinoma seen in MRI. And speaking about dense breasts and young individuals, we should include the ultrasound as a complementary screening tool to mammography in screening programs. Studies show that ultrasound alone is not a good breast cancer screening tool and has many false positive and false negative results. However, it may be useful addition to screening mammography among women with dense breast parenchyma, women with detected mammography lesions, and women at high risk of developing breast cancer. This is one good example where we have a heterogeneous dense breast, and even if we see this large carcinoma on the ultrasound, it's very difficult to pinpoint where the carcinoma is on the mammography. Actually, it was present here all the time, but it was obscured by the surrounding breast parenchyma. We should also mention the breast self and clinical examinations, although they have long been termed the deceiving screening tools. Yet we have to admit that they are low-cost techniques performable by oneself, medical and non-medical staff, and some studies have reported high sensitivity and specificity. And now we're going to put things together. Do we have to screen for breast cancer? The answer is yes, because we have a high incidence of breast cancer. We have signs which allow for early detection of breast cancer, like the microcalcifications. We have early diagnosis was found to be much more cost-effective than late diagnosis. And we have reliable screening tools, namely mammography and MRI, which is incorporated in screening programs with mammography for high-risk individuals. When should we start screening any female patient at the age of 20 to 30 years? She should be taught how to do the breast self-examination, and she should continue doing so in her 30s. Starting at the age of 30, we should have the risk factor of every female patient assessed, and if she is a high-risk individual, she should start doing her mammography and MRI starting by the age of 30. By the age of 40, all female patients are eligible for a mammography examination, and they should continue doing so long as they are in good health. What are the screening modalities in use? Of course, mammography still remains the gold standard of examination. The breast self and clinical examination have questionable benefits. The ultrasound should be used as a complementary technique when abnormalities are identified on mammography, and MRI should be used as a complementary technique, and it should be incorporated in the screening of high-risk individuals. And we have new mammography techniques which have the potential to be implemented in screening programs, and namely this is the 3D digital tomosynthesis. And thank you.
Thank you, dear Professor Rasha Kamal, for this very elegant, outstanding, and informative presentation. Thank you once more. And now I am greatly honored to introduce my Professor, Dr. Wafa al-Mutanawi, Professor of Cancer Radiation Biology, Cairo University Medical School, Clinical Oncology Center. She'll be talking about the hereditary breast cancer. Welcome, Professor Wafa.
now we are taking you to one entity of high-risk breast cancer, and which is the hereditary and familial breast cancers. To start with, since the last years of the last century, by the end of the last century, several chromosomes have been considered or have been identified to carry some genes relevant to the hereditary breast cancer and colon cancer. And then, by the advance of years, many other genes have been discovered on chromosomes and to be incriminated and causing a hereditary risk of cancer. These genes are usually either repairing genes that repair defects coming on the during the cellular division and during the synthesis of DNA during cellular division, and in this case, these genes fail to repair any eventual defect occurring in these genes. And now we have to settle some definitions. The first is sporadic cancer. Sporadic cancer is cancer which occurs sporadically due to bad luck, as it has been reported recently, due to errors in the genes during cellular division. And on the other side, there is hereditary cancer, in which a specific mutation in a single major gene strongly contributes to the development of a specific cancer. And here we deal with BRCA1 and BRCA2 hereditary breast cancer. In between, there are some familial cancers that occur in certain families. They cluster due to some errors in these repairing genes. Not only one defined specific repairing gene, but maybe multiplicity or differences in repairing genes, which we have demonstrated in the last slide. In these families, we can encounter pancreatic cancer, colon cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, and in this case, not specifically one gene which causes cancer, but it is the genomic instability that occurs in these families that contribute to different types of cancers. And this is called the familial cancer. Now, in a general population, the sporadic cancer is the most frequently encountered, and the hereditary one, which is inherited or carried or transformed by the germline mutations, is the hereditary cancer, does not account more than 10%, whereas the familial cancers occur much more frequently. So, germline mutations, in which hereditary breast cancer is the main issue, are mutations that occur in the eggs or in the sperms and are heritable and cause cancer family syndromes, and they are carried, these defective genes are carried on all the cells of the individual, because they are transferred in the germline cells. Whereas sporadic cancer, where there is somatic mutation, occurs in one single cell in the mammary cell, one of the mammary cells, and contribute to sporadic cancer. And this does not occur in families, it is non-heritable, and it is one of the acquired alterations of all common cancers. What are these genes? They are oncogenes, which are almost concerned with sporadic cancer, as EGFR in lung cancer, RAS mutation in colon cancer, but in hereditary and familial cancer, they are almost repairing genes, which we call tumor-specific genes or mismatch repair genes. Why genes are important? Because they give information to provide proteins which modulate the function of the cell. So whether these alterations, whether acquired or genetically determined, the accumulation of these genes can lead to cancer genesis. And this which is expressed as the tumor phenotype. The tumor phenotype is the the type of alterations, of genetic alterations, which modulate the biological behavior of the tumor, which we call the tumor phenotype. By the end of 2003, the finished version of the human genome sequence has been finished, and by virtue of this deciphering of the human genome, many genomic alterations have been identified, and their proposed mechanism of action has been determined as being relevant to many tumors. And this paved the way to the development of targeted therapies to these tumors, which will have much broader safety profile and much important pharmacogenomic effect on these tumors. And in fact, breast cancer was a big gainer from deciphering the human genome in both the sporadic cancer and in the hereditary cancer. In sporadic cancers, we identified the HER2 gene, and by virtue of this identification, we could develop the Herceptin for these patients carrying this amplification of HER2 genes. And the identification of BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutation in hereditary cancer also paved the way to the development of drugs that are AMP inhibitors, which inhibit or target the mismatch repair gene. So deciphering the sequence of the human genome revealed more details of the molecular profile of familial and hereditary breast cancer. Now, regarding the statistics, in hereditary breast cancer, BRCA1 and BRCA2 represent more than 80% of these cases, and other cancer genes or mismatch repair genes are involved in the last third. The clinical features of hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome are very important to identify. We have, firstly, the family history considerations, where ovarian cancer, it is a very important factor if it is present in the family. If one of the family members was previously identified as carrier of BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutation, and also if there is within the family an early onset breast cancer at younger age, or in cases where there are familial prostate cancer, because BRCA1 and BRCA2 also cause male prostate cancer and male female and male breast cancer. Sometimes the small overall family size or those containing few female relatives may mask the underlying BRCA mutations. Some red flags for hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome is the presence of ovarian cancer in the family, breast cancer at age lesser than 50, or two primary breast cancers, or the presence of male breast cancer, or the presence of triple negative breast cancer, or also pancreatic cancer with a hereditary breast cancer ovarian syndrome. Also, the Ashkenazi ethnic is also one of the involved. And the histology also is important, because breast cancer carriers for gene BRCA1 and BRCA2 are more likely to be of the basal phenotype. The majority of them is triple negative, ER, PR, and HER2 negative. The BRCA2 have a similar histology and prognosis. As regarding breast ovarian syndrome, they are predominantly papillary serous and possible survival advantage compared to non-BRCA related ovarian cancer. So this entity of hereditary and familial breast cancer represent not less than 15 to 20% of the whole population with breast cancer. In a center where I work, we see 2,000 new cases of cancer every year, 40% of them are breast cancer patients. So this is a good number. About 1,000 breast cancer every year have been seen in one center, in one hospital center. This means that the hereditary and familial breast cancer represent about 10 to 15 to 20% of these cases, which need early detection by virtue of the younger age of these patients and also the socio-psychological status of these patients and the complications of this aggressive disease when affects a younger population. Now, identifying and managing hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome, we have to admit that carrying a BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutation carries a 10 more relative risk as compared to any other factor contributing to breast cancer. It is 10 times as late menopause, 10 times risk as postmenopausal obesity, 10 times as risk as for compared to those patients receiving hormone replacement therapy, and also more than twice the risk of patients previously exposed to radiation of the chest. BRCA mutations also increase breast and ovarian cancer risk along the age. By the age of 50, there is much higher risk exposure, much higher risk to attain breast cancer in those BRCA carriers than other population, and by the age of 70, this risk increases, and also the risk of ovarian cancer increases by the age in these breast cancer gene carriers. Also, BRCA mutations increase the risk of a second cancer, but with respect to the normal population along the ages. In men, BRCA mutations also increase the risk of prostate cancer and male breast cancer. So it is very important to identify patients at risk of these mutations and these mutation carriers. According to the ESMO guidelines 2012, it is widely accepted clinical criteria for referral, because we apply for identifying or for carrying out this test to apply the ESMO guidelines. Regarding the family history, if there are more than 3 members in the family with breast cancer at ages below 50, 2 members with breast cancer at the age of below 40, and if there is more than 1 family member with breast cancer and with early onset breast cancer. What is the modality of detection? Of course, the last decade we relied on the long-range PCR and the sequencing. Also, the sequencing is the golden standard for detection of BRCA analysis in hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome. But now, next generation sequencing technologies allow very meticulous detection of large number of high throughput of patients with BRCA mutations. It defines the point mutations, defines the copy number, which has implication on the severity of the disease, the gross rearrangements within the gene, the BRCA gene, the translocation profile of these BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes. Now there are a panel in the next generation sequencer which is called the TrueSight cancer set for hereditary and familial cancer. It does not only identify the BRCA1 and the BRCA2 genes, but it also identifies several genes involved in hereditary and familial cancers, including hereditary and sporadic cancer also, to which many drugs are now in clinical trials in development by the pharmacogenomics. And this is very important to identify this set of genes in families where there is clustering of malignancies, whether breast, colon, pancreas, or any other prostate familial cancer. About the management of hereditary cancer, this is very important because chemoprevention trials now are very fast running, and of course surveillance and providing the imaging specialists by these patients in order to follow up them at early stages once they are characterized in appropriate timing is very important for early detection and for avoidance of complications of this disease if it is deemed to be advanced. Also, there is the prophylactic surgery, which is not completely approved in our society, but the close surveillance by imaging technologies is very important for these patients. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wafaa, for this informative presentation. And the next speaker is Dr. Nagla Abdelrazek, Professor Dr. Nagla Abdelrazek. Dr. Nagla will combine the first and the last lecture in one single lecture entitled Latest Guidelines and Quality Assurance in Screening.
First, I would like to thank the faculty and coordinators and the organizers behind the conference. I would like very much to thank the attendee for coming early and attending with us. I also would like to thank Professor, the chairperson, Professor Rasha Kamal, for taking a very good task and doing much effort for the success of this session, and also Professor Wafaa El-Mitnawi. She enriched the session and panel by her outstanding experience in the hereditary breast cancer, and my dearest friend and professor, Dr. Iman Zaki, for coming to join us and share the session. I think everything about the screening was covered, especially by the two last lectures of Professor Rasha Kamal and Professor Wafaa El-Mitnawi. So I will try to wrap up. I will give you an idea about the latest guidelines in the breast cancer screening, the latest paper provided by the ECR in the year 2010. Do we have a screening program in Egypt? Of course we have. We are all honored, me and my colleagues, Dr. Rasha, Dr. Noran, Professor Ashraf Salim. We are working in the national screening program. It was headed by the Professor Duraya Salim, and it was first launched in October the year 2007. The program, if you don't know about the program consists of 10 digital mammography vans moving throughout the governorates to screen women above the age of 40. The national screening program managed to screen about 128 Egyptian women so far. The age was till last year was above 45, but now we reduced the age to include all women above the age of 40. We have several publications, and to sum up the results of our publication, the incidence of breast cancer in our screened population is 2.1%, and the recall rate was 12%. The mean tumor size was 2.4%, which is relatively large for screening, and the interventional procedures done represent 9%. The primary screening represents 85% of our population, and the prevalence screening represents 15%. The overall participation in the screening is unfortunately less than 30%. The program has challenges. The main challenge were operational errors, patient illiteracy, the increased demand to maintain the continuous funding system for purchasing the mobile and maintaining the annual running cost. The introduction of screening of breast cancer in Egypt will continue to provide the role of primary prevention, early diagnosis and treatment, raising public awareness about the disease, and role of screening in primary prevention will continue to be the main weapon to fight against breast cancer. And to do better, we need to work on our financial plan to incorporate NGOs for population awareness and education, and advocacy groups, media campaigns to decrease the myths about breast cancer, and work on achieving high-quality manual and quality assurance program to train more breast radiologists, and also to collaborate with all health providers for breast cancer screening treatment to help the patient to throughout her journey since beginning and discovery of breast cancer till the final treatment. And from here I invite everybody who wants to work with the screening with us to help in the screening program. Now coming to the breast cancer screening with imaging recommendations paper, the latest paper released by the ACR about the use of mammography, breast MRI and breast ultrasound and other technologies. I just will pinpoint the consensus and the guidelines because everything was fruitfully demonstrated by the lectures of my colleagues. Screening for breast cancer with mammography has been shown to decrease the mortality from breast cancer, and mammography is the mainstay for screening of clinically occult disease. Mammography, however, has well-recognized limitations, and recently other imaging modalities, including ultrasound, MRI, have been used as adjuvant screening tools, mainly in women who may be at increased risk for development of breast cancer. The Society for Breast Cancer Imaging and Breast Imaging Commission of the ACR are issuing these recommendations to provide guidance for the patients and clinicians and doctors on the use of imaging to screen breast cancer patients. Whenever possible, the recommendations are based on available evidence. Where evidence is lacking, the recommendations are based on consensus opinion of the fellows and the executive committee of the Society of Breast Imaging and the members of the Breast Imaging Commission of the ACR. First, to go through the guidelines, we will start by imaging technique mammography. Women at average age of breast cancer, annual screening mammogram should start at 40. Women at increased risk of breast cancer, women with certain BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutations, or who are untested but have first-degree relative, mother, sister, and daughters who are proved to have BRCA genes, yearly starting the mammogram at the age of 30, but not before the age of 25. Women with 20% lifetime risk of breast cancer on the basis of family history, both maternal and paternal, yearly starting at the age of 30, but not before the age of 25, or 10 years earlier than the age of diagnosis of the youngest affected relative, whichever is later. By women with mothers and sisters with premenopausal breast cancer, yearly starting by the age of 30, but not before the age of 25, or 10 years earlier than the age of diagnosis of the youngest affected relative, which is later again. Women with history of MET radiation, usually for Hodgkin disease, received between the age of 10 and the age of 30, yearly starting 8 years after radiation therapy, but not before the age of 25. Women with biopsy-proven lobular carcinoma in situ and atypical lobular hyperplasia, atypical ductal hyperplasia, ductal carcinoma in situ, invasive breast carcinoma, or ovarian cancer yearly started the screening from the diagnosis regardless the age. Then, about screening by ultrasound, they stated that it can be considered in high-risk women for whom magnetic MRI resonance may be inappropriate.